In the remote wilderness of Alaska's Denali National Park, where survival is measured in heartbeats and hope is a luxury few can afford, a massive grizzly bear named Atlas was about to do something that had never been documented in the history of wildlife research. His 8-month-old cub, Scout, was trapped in a situation no father could rescue him from alone. What Atlas did next defied every law of nature, challenged everything scientists thought they knew about animal intelligence, and proved that love has no boundaries, even between natural enemies. This isn't just a survival story. This is about the moment when a father's desperation became a miracle that changed how we see the animal kingdom forever. The rescue that followed was so extraordinary that wildlife experts are still trying to understand how it was even possible. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more incredible stories like this to you. Atlas had been watching over Scout from the moment his cub took his first breath 8 months ago. At 800 pounds of pure muscle and protective instinct, Atlas was everything a father grizzly should be: powerful, vigilant, and completely devoted to his offspring. Scout's mother had died during a harsh winter, leaving Atlas to fill both parental roles in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. The bond between them was extraordinary, even by grizzly standards. Where most male bears left cub rearing entirely to females, Atlas had embraced fatherhood with a tenderness that wildlife researchers had never documented. He taught Scout how to fish by demonstrating perfect technique dozens of times. He showed him which berries were safe and which would cause sickness. Most importantly, he taught him the invisible boundaries that kept them both alive in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. This morning had started like any other. The salmon run was at its peak, and Atlas had planned to spend the day teaching Scout advanced fishing techniques in the shallow rapids of the Teclanica River. The early September air carried the crisp promise of winter, reminding both bears that every meal could be their last before the long hibernation ahead. Scout, now weighing 60 pounds and full of the confidence that comes with having the strongest father in the territory, bounded ahead toward the water's edge. His golden-brown fur caught the morning sunlight as he practiced the fishing stance Atlas had shown him the day before. Back legs planted firmly on submerged rocks, front paws ready to strike with lightning precision. Atlas followed at his usual protective distance, close enough to intervene if danger appeared, far enough to let Scout develop the independence that would keep him alive in adulthood. His amber eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, reading the forest for signs of threat. Wolves, other bears, sudden weather changes. Any of these could turn a peaceful fishing lesson into a fight for survival. That's when Atlas heard the sound that would haunt him forever. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it was coming from beneath their feet. Scout was standing on what appeared to be solid rock at the river's edge, practicing his fishing stance, when the ground beneath him began to shift. The massive boulder he was using as a platform wasn't solid bedrock. It was a precariously balanced stone that had been slowly undermining for months by the rushing water beneath. Atlas roared a warning, but physics moved faster than sound. The boulder tilted, then rolled, taking Scout with it into a crevice that had been hidden beneath the water's surface. The splash was followed by a sound that no parent ever wants to hear: the desperate cries of their child in mortal danger. Scout had fallen into a natural stone trap, a narrow chimney formed by fallen boulders that created a prison 8 feet deep and barely 2 feet wide. The walls were smooth granite, impossible to climb, and the opening at the top was too narrow for Atlas to reach through. Worse, the bottom of the crevice was slowly filling with water as the river found this new channel. Atlas circled the opening frantically, his massive paws scraping against stone as he tried every possible angle of rescue. He could see Scout far below, the cub's terrified eyes reflecting what little the water level at the bottom of the crevice was rising. Scout, exhausted from trying to climb the impossible walls, was beginning to panic as the cold water reached his chest. His small voice echoed up from the depths, each cry a knife through Atlas's heart. That's when Atlas looked up and saw salvation circling overhead. Denali, a massive golden eagle with a 12-foot wingspan, had been drawn by the sounds of distress. The great bird rode the thermal currents above the river valley, his keen eyes taking in the drama below. Eagles were Atlas's natural enemies. They were known to take bear cubs when the opportunity arose. Under normal circumstances, Atlas would have roared a challenge that would send any eagle fleeing to distant skies. But these weren't normal circumstances. Atlas studied the great bird circling above, his intelligent mind processing an impossible idea. Denali was large enough, strong enough, to lift Scout from the crevice, if he could somehow be convinced to help instead of harm. The eagle's talons, which Atlas had always seen as weapons, were suddenly the only tools that could save his son. In that moment, Atlas made a decision that would challenge everything science thought it knew about animal behavior. Instead of threatening the eagle, he was going to ask for help. What happened next would be remembered as the day when a father's love rewrote the laws of nature itself. Atlas stood at the edge of the crevice, his massive head tilted skyward, watching Denali circle on the morning thermals. The golden eagle's keen eyes had already assessed the situation below. A grizzly bear cub trapped in a stone prison, growing weaker with each passing minute as cold water rose around his small body. Under normal circumstances, this would be an opportunity for Denali. Eagle predation on bear cubs was rare, but not unheard of, especially when the cubs were vulnerable and separated from protection. But something about the adult male's behavior was unlike anything the great bird had witnessed in his 8 years ruling these skies. Atlas wasn't displaying aggression. He wasn't roaring threats or making the territorial charges that usually drove eagles away from bear families. Instead, the massive grizzly was doing something that seemed impossible. He was trying to communicate. The great bear began with the universal language of distress. His vocalizations started deep and mournful, the kind of sounds that carried across valleys to communicate loss or urgent need to other bears. But when Denali continued circling without descending, Atlas tried something different. He began to pace in a figure-8 pattern around the crevice opening, his movements deliberate and repetitive. To human observers, it might have looked like anxiety, but Denali's predator brain recognized it as intentional communication. Bears didn't move in repetitive patterns without reason. This was purposeful, directed behavior. Atlas then did something that would later be studied by animal behaviorists around the world. He walked to the river's edge, grasped a large salmon in his powerful jaws, and placed it on a prominent rock near the crevice. Then he backed away, watching the eagle intently. The message was unmistakable. offering. Denali had seen humans feed bears, had observed the complex social exchanges between mother bears and cubs, but he had never witnessed a wild animal attempting to negotiate with a member of another species. The salmon represented value, calories, protein, survival currency in the harsh Alaskan wilderness. The golden eagle's response was cautious but curious. He descended in a slow spiral, landing on a tall spruce tree about 50 yards from the trapped cub. From this vantage point, Denali could clearly see Scout in the bottom of the stone chimney, water now reaching the cub's shoulders, his small paws scrabbling helplessly against the smooth granite walls. Atlas saw the eagle's interest and intensified his efforts. He returned to the river and caught another salmon, larger than the first, placing it near the original offering. Then he did something that sent chills through Denali's raptor instincts. Atlas prostrated himself. The massive grizzly lowered his entire body to the ground. Denali felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with predatory opportunity. The great eagle had raised 3 clutches of his own offspring in his lifetime. He had felt the fierce protective drive that made parents risk everything for their young. What he was witnessing below wasn't just unusual animal behavior. It was pure parental desperation, raw and honest, and impossible to ignore. The eagle's decision came in stages. First, he flew down to claim the salmon Atlas had offered, a tentative acceptance of the bargain being proposed. Atlas remained motionless in his submissive position, even when the great bird landed within striking distance of his massive claws. Then, Denali did something that would be caught on a trail camera and become one of the most studied pieces of wildlife footage in history. He looked directly at Atlas, tilted his magnificent head toward the crevice where Scout was trapped, and let out a call. Not the harsh scream of a hunting eagle, but a softer, more complex vocalization that seemed almost like acknowledgement. Atlas raised his head, hope blazing in his amber eyes. The eagle was listening. The eagle understood. What followed was the most extraordinary interspecies communication ever documented in the wild. Atlas stood and moved to the crevice opening, pointing with his massive snout toward his trapped cub. Denali hopped closer, peering down into the narrow stone chimney with his incredibly keen eyesight. The eagle's brain processed the challenge with predatory efficiency. The crevice was too narrow for the bear's massive frame, but perfectly sized for aerial approach. The cub weighed perhaps 60 pounds, well within his carrying capacity for short distances. The stone walls that trapped the bear could become launching platforms for a creature designed for vertical flight. But the risk was enormous. Descending into the narrow space would leave Denali vulnerable, unable to spread his wings for quick escape. If this was some elaborate trap, if the father bear's desperation turned to aggression once the eagle was within reach, it could mean death for them both. Scout's weakening cries from below made the decision for him. The water was now at the cub's neck, and his struggles were becoming more frantic as hypothermia began to set in. Minutes mattered now. Denali spread his magnificent wings, caught Atlas's gaze one final time, and prepared for the most dangerous rescue attempt of his life. Denali's first attempt to reach Scout was a reconnaissance mission. The golden eagle descended slowly into the narrow crevice, his 12-foot wingspan folded tight against his body as he navigated the treacherous stone walls. The space was even more challenging than it had appeared from above, barely wide enough for his body, with irregular granite surfaces that could damage his delicate flight feathers if he moved carelessly. Scout looked up at the approaching predator with the confusion of a cub who had never learned to fear eagles. His father had always been there to drive away aerial threats. In his 8-month-old mind, anything approaching meant potential rescue, regardless of species. He reached up with his small paws, whimpering softly, water now lapping at his chin. Denali assessed the situation with the calculating mind of a raptor. The cub was weak from cold and fear, but still conscious and responsive. The water level was rising at approximately 1 inch every 10 minutes. Scout had perhaps 20 minutes before drowning became inevitable. The rescue would require perfect timing, extraordinary trust, and a level of interspecies cooperation that existed nowhere in nature's documented history. From above, Atlas watched every moment with an intensity that bordered on supernatural. His massive body trembled with the effort of restraining. The moment of contact sent electric tension through Atlas above. He watched his son in the grip of a natural enemy, every muscle in his 800-pound frame coiled for action. But Scout's response wasn't fear, it was hope. The cub looked up at Denali with complete trust, somehow understanding that this predator meant salvation. Denali's first lift attempt revealed the true challenge. Scout's waterlogged fur added significant weight, and the cub's natural response to being grasped was to curl into a defensive ball, making him difficult to balance. After raising Scout only 3 feet, Denali was forced to set him down again, the narrow walls making stable flight impossible. From above, Atlas released a sound that wildlife researchers would later describe as the most heartbreaking vocalization ever recorded from a wild grizzly, a moan of pure despair that seemed to acknowledge his complete helplessness. But Denali wasn't finished. The golden eagle's second attempt incorporated a strategy that demonstrated intelligence bordering on genius. Instead of trying to lift Scout straight up through the narrow opening, Denali positioned himself to use the crevice walls as leverage. Bracing his powerful talons against the stone surfaces, he could generate upward thrust while maintaining stability. This time, when he grasped Scout's shoulders, Denali added something unprecedented: gentleness. His talons, capable of crushing the skulls of prey animals, held the cub with the delicate pressure of a parent carrying their own offspring. Scout seemed to sense the change, relaxing in the eagle's grip instead of fighting it. Slowly, carefully, Denali began to ascend. Using his powerful legs to push against the crevice walls, he half climbed, half flew upward with his precious cargo. Scout hung motionless in his grip, somehow understanding that cooperation meant survival. But 6 feet from the surface, disaster struck. Denali's right wing brushed against a protruding rock, sending sharp pain through his shoulder and causing him to lose his rhythm. For a terrifying moment, eagle and cub teetered on the edge of a fatal fall back into the stone prison. Atlas, watching from above, couldn't contain his instincts any longer. His massive roar of anguish echoed across the valley, a sound so raw and desperate that it seemed to shake the very mountains. In that roar was every father's nightmare, being forced to watch his child face death while remaining powerless to help. Denali, hanging precariously in the narrow space with Scout in his talons, heard something in that roar that transcended species boundaries. It was the sound of a parent's breaking heart, the cry of love pushed beyond all endurance. In that moment, the golden eagle understood that failure meant more than Scout's death. It meant destroying a father's soul. With superhuman effort, Denali adjusted his grip, ignored the pain in his injured wing, and made one final desperate push toward the surface. Using every ounce of strength in his powerful body, he launched himself and Scout upward in a surge of wings and determination that seemed to defy gravity itself. They broke the surface of the crevice just as Scout's strength gave out completely. The cub went limp in Denali's talons, unconscious from cold and exhaustion, his small body finally succumbing to the trauma of the ordeal. But they were free. Denali landed heavily on the granite beside the crevice, his injured wing sending spikes of pain through his body. Gently, carefully, he released Scout onto the warm stone and stepped back, watching as Atlas rushed forward to reclaim his son. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Atlas reached Scout in 3 bounding strides, his massive paws surprisingly gentle as he rolled his unconscious cub onto his side. Scout's small body was limp and cold, his golden fur darkened with river water, tiny chest barely rising and falling with shallow breaths. Hypothermia was setting in rapidly, and Atlas knew from harsh experience that cubs didn't always come back from this level of exposure. Denali stood nearby, favoring his injured right wing, watching the reunion with eyes that held an emotion no wildlife researcher had ever documented in a golden eagle, something that looked remarkably like concern. The great bird had risked everything to save a natural enemy's offspring, and now he seemed invested in the outcome of his unprecedented rescue. That's when Atlas did something that would be studied by animal behaviorists for decades to come. Instead of continuing his solitary efforts to revive Scout, he looked directly at Denali and vocalized, not a threat or territorial call, but something that sounded almost like a request. The golden eagle understood immediately. Scout needed more than warmth. He needed the specialized knowledge that came from Denali's unique perspective on survival in extreme conditions. Eagles understood hypothermia and recovery in ways that ground-dwelling animals didn't. They lived at altitudes where temperature changes could be fatal, where knowledge of thermoregulation meant the difference between life and death. Denali approached cautiously, his keen eyes assessing Scout's condition with clinical precision. The cub's breathing was too shallow, his body temperature dropping too rapidly for simple warming to be effective. What Scout needed was stimulation, the kind of aggressive revival technique that could restart his body's natural heating mechanisms. What happened next had never been observed in wild animal behavior. Denali positioned himself near Scout's head and began to use his powerful beak to stimulate specific pressure points along the cub's neck and behind his ears, areas where major blood vessels ran close to the surface. The technique was similar to what eagles use to revive their own offspring, who had been exposed to extreme cold at high altitudes. Atlas watched with an intensity that bordered on supernatural, every muscle in his massive frame tense with the effort of allowing a predator to minister to his unconscious cub. Trust doesn't come easily to apex predators, but desperation had taught Atlas to accept help from the most unlikely source. Denali's ministrations continued for nearly 10 minutes, his precise beak movements stimulating circulation while Atlas provided steady warmth. The golden eagle's actions were methodical, almost medical in their precision, demonstrating an understanding of mammalian physiology that seemed to transcend species knowledge. Then, like a miracle emerging from the edge of death, Scout's eyes fluttered open. The cub's first sight was his father's massive, worried face hovering over him, amber eyes bright with relief and love. Scout's weak whimper of recognition sent a wave of emotion through Atlas that was visible in every line of his powerful body, the loosening of shoulders that had been rigid with fear, the gentle rumble of reassurance that vibrated through his chest. But Scout's second sight was even more remarkable. The cub's gaze fell on Denali, standing just feet away, and instead of fear or confusion, Scout's expression showed something that could only be described as recognition. Somehow, even in his semi-conscious state during the rescue, Scout had understood that this eagle meant salvation, not threat. Atlas followed his cub's gaze to Denali, and in that moment, something passed between the grizzly bear and the golden eagle that had never been documented in the natural world. It wasn't just gratitude. It was acknowledgement. Recognition. The beginning of a bond that would challenge everything science thought it knew about interspecies relationships. Scout, growing stronger by the minute in his father's warmth, made a sound that stunned both adult animals. It was a soft vocalization, almost like purring, directed specifically at Denali. The cub was thanking his rescuer in the only language he knew. Denali's response was immediate and extraordinary. The great eagle lowered his magnificent head in what could only be interpreted as acceptance of Scout's gratitude. Then, moving with the grace that had carried him through thousands of hunts, Denali spread his injured wing and gently extended it over both bears, not as a threat, but as a shelter. For nearly an hour, the three animals remained in this impossible tableau. Atlas continued warming his cub while Denali provided aerial cover, his keen eyes scanning the sky for threats that might take advantage of the vulnerable family. The eagle's wing, despite his injury, remained steadily extended, creating additional windbreak and warmth for the recovering cub. As Scout's strength returned and his body temperature normalized, Atlas began to face a new reality. The debt he owed Denali was beyond anything that existed in nature's accounting. His cub was alive because a natural enemy had chosen cooperation over predation, had risked everything to save a stranger's offspring. But more than that, Atlas was beginning to understand that what had happened between when Scout was finally strong enough to sit up on his own, when his small body had stopped shivering and his eyes had regained their bright alertness, Atlas made a decision that would echo through the wilderness for years to come. He was going to find a way to repay the debt, and in doing so, he was going to discover that the bonds formed in crisis could be stronger than any force in nature. 3 days had passed since the rescue, and Atlas found himself in unfamiliar territory, both geographically and emotionally. He and Scout had followed Denali to the Eagle's mountain territory, a journey that went against every territorial instinct Atlas possessed, but felt necessary nonetheless. The debt weighed on him like a physical burden, demanding acknowledgement and repayment. Denali's Eyrie was located on a sheer cliff face overlooking the Teclanica Valley, accessible only to creatures with wings. The golden eagle's injured wing was healing slowly, but the damage was more severe than initially apparent. A torn muscle near his shoulder joint had left him unable to achieve the altitude and speed necessary for hunting larger prey. For a raptor of Denali's size and energy requirements, this was a death sentence postponed only by finite fat reserves. Atlas had observed Denali's increasingly desperate hunting attempts from the valley below. The great eagle was reduced to catching small rodents and fish near the water's surface, prey that provided insufficient calories for his massive frame. Each failed hunt brought Denali closer to the starvation that claimed injured raptors with ruthless efficiency. Scout, now fully recovered and more energetic than ever, seemed to understand the gravity of their situation better than his young age should have allowed. The cub stayed close to his father during their vigil, occasionally looking up at the distant cliff where their rescuer struggled for survival. On the third evening, Atlas made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He was going to hunt for Denali. The logistics were staggering. Eagles ate meat, but their dietary requirements were specific: fresh prey, properly sized, delivered to heights no bear could reach. Atlas would need to overcome not just the physical challenges of providing for an aerial predator, but the psychological barriers of feeding a natural enemy. His first attempt was crude but effective. Atlas caught a large salmon during the evening run, but instead of consuming it immediately, he carried it to the base of Denali's cliff. Using powerful vocalizations, he called to the eagle above, then placed the fish on a prominent boulder before retreating to a respectful distance. Denali's response was cautious but curious. The golden eagle descended slowly, clearly suspicious of potential traps, but hunger eventually overcame wariness. When he reached the salmon, Denali found it was not only fresh and perfectly sized, but had been carefully cleaned. Atlas had removed the head and scales, leaving only the nutrient-rich flesh that eagles preferred. This ritual continued for a week. Each evening, Atlas would hunt specifically for Denali, learning through trial and error which prey the eagle favored and how to prepare it properly. Scout participated by helping to position the offerings and retreating alongside his father to allow Denali safe access to the food. But Atlas soon realized that salmon alone wouldn't be enough. Denali needed the kind of high-protein, high-fat diet that only came from hunting ptarmigan, Arctic ground squirrels, and other prey that lived in terrain inaccessible to bears. The eagle's wing was healing, but slowly, and his energy reserves were still dangerously low. That's when Atlas, for Denali, watching from his cliff eyrie, Atlas's efforts represented something beyond simple debt repayment. The grizzly bear was learning to think like an eagle, to understand the world from an aerial predator's perspective. This level of cognitive flexibility and empathy between species had never been documented in wildlife research. As Atlas's hunting skills improved and Denali's strength returned, something remarkable began to emerge between them. Communication evolved beyond simple food exchange into complex cooperation. Denali began using his superior vantage point to guide Atlas toward prey, calling out directional information that the bear learned to interpret and act upon. When Atlas hunted mountain goats along treacherous cliff faces, Denali would position himself to drive the animals toward areas where the bear could intercept them. When Denali needed fish during his recovery, Atlas would herd salmon into shallow pools where the eagle could safely wade in to catch them. Scout, observing this unprecedented cooperation, began developing behaviors that belonged to no species' natural repertoire. He learned to respond to eagle calls, to position himself for hunting strategies that incorporated aerial intelligence, to think of their family unit as including a member who lived in the sky. But the most remarkable development was emotional rather than tactical. Atlas and Denali had moved beyond debt and repayment into something that could only be called friendship. When Denali's wing finally healed completely, and he was capable of resuming independent hunting, he chose not to leave. Instead, He remained in the territory he now shared with Atlas and Scout, their unusual family unit having become a permanent alliance. Wildlife researchers who eventually discovered and documented their relationship would struggle to classify what they were witnessing. It wasn't symbiosis. Each animal was capable of independent survival. It wasn't temporary cooperation. Their bond strengthened over time rather than dissolving when the crisis passed. What Atlas and Denali had created was something entirely new in the natural world, a chosen family that transcended every boundary biology had ever recognized. 6 months after the rescue that brought them together, Atlas, Scout, and Denali had developed a communication system so sophisticated that Dr. Sarah Chen, the wildlife biologist studying their unprecedented relationship, called it the most complex interspecies language ever documented in the wild. Their territory in Denali National Park had become a laboratory of cooperation. Atlas had expanded his hunting range to include prey he had never pursued before Denali's arrival. The eagle's aerial reconnaissance capabilities allowed the bear to locate game with efficiency that astounded researchers tracking their movements via GPS collars. But it was Scout who had become the true bridge between worlds. Now, 14 months old and weighing 150 pounds, the young grizzly displayed behaviors that belonged to no known species. He would respond to Denali's hunting calls by positioning himself for collaborative captures. He had learned to climb higher and more skillfully than typical bears, seeking vantage points that allowed him to communicate with their aerial family member. Most remarkably, Scout had developed a vocabulary of vocalizations that seemed specifically designed for communicating with eagles. These weren't bear sounds adapted for a new purpose. They were entirely novel vocalizations that Denali understood and responded to with uncanny precision. Dr. Chen's research team had initially approached their study with skepticism. Interspecies cooperation existed in nature, but nothing like what local rangers had reported. A grizzly bear, a golden eagle, and a bear cub functioning as a coordinated hunting unit challenged fundamental assumptions about territorial behavior, dietary competition, and predator psychology. But 6 months of observation had provided evidence that was impossible to dismiss. Trail cameras captured sequences that seemed to defy natural law. Atlas driving caribou along predetermined routes, while Denali provided aerial coordination, Scout positioning himself for intercepts with timing that required advanced planning and complex communication. The most stunning footage came from a hunt involving a wounded moose, an animal far too large for any of them to tackle individually. The sequence showed Denali conducting aerial reconnaissance to assess the moose's condition and escape routes. Atlas and Scout then positioned themselves on opposite sides of a narrow valley, while Denali used precisely timed diving attacks to direct the moose toward Atlas's ambush point. The hunt succeeded not through brute force, but through strategy that incorporated each animal's unique capabilities into a unified plan. It was warfare conducted with intelligence that transcended species limitations. But their cooperation extended beyond hunting into areas that touched the very definition of family. When Scout was injured during a fishing expedition, his paw caught between rocks during a particularly ambitious salmon grab, both Atlas and Denali responded with parental urgency. Atlas provided the immediate physical care, using his massive strength to free Scout's trapped paw and his warm body to comfort the frightened cub. but it was Denali who contributed the specialized knowledge that prevented serious complications. The Golden Eagle's keen eyesight detected that Scout's paw was more severely injured than Atlas had realized, a small fracture that could become debilitating if not properly managed. Denali's response was to guide Atlas toward specific locations where the bear could find medicinal plants that eagles instinctively knew promoted bone healing. For 3 weeks, Denali maintained constant aerial surveillance over Scout during his recovery, watching for signs of infection or complication that his superior vision could detect before they became life-threatening. The eagle's devotion to Scout's welfare was complete and unwavering, displaying protective instincts typically reserved for his own offspring. Scout's recovery period also revealed the emotional depth of their unusual family bond. The young bear became restless and depressed when confined to limited movement, but Denali discovered a solution that demonstrated remarkable empathy and creativity. The Golden Eagle began performing aerial displays specifically for Scout's entertainment. Complex flight patterns, dramatic dives, and acrobatic maneuvers that seemed designed purely to lift the injured cub's spirits. These weren't hunting behaviors or territorial displays. They were performances, conducted solely for the pleasure of a young bear who couldn't participate in normal activities. Atlas watched these displays with an expression that Dr. Chen could only describe as gratitude mixed with wonder. The massive grizzly seemed to understand that Denali was providing something Atlas couldn't, a form of care that required wings and sky, and the kind of grace that only existed in flight. When Scout finally healed completely, their first collaborative hunt was a celebration disguised as necessity. The three moved through their territory with joy that was visible in every interaction. Atlas's playful mock charges, Scout's exuberant climbing, Denali's spectacular aerial flourishes that served no purpose except expressing the pure pleasure of being reunited as a complete family unit. Dr. Chen's final report on their first year together would conclude with observations that challenged everything the scientific community thought it knew about animal psychology. What we're witnessing isn't just cooperation or symbiosis. Atlas, Scout, and Denali have created something that can only be called love, a bond that transcends species boundaries and demonstrates that family is defined not by genetics, but by choice, commitment, and mutual care. But their story was far from over. The most extraordinary test of their relationship was still ahead, a crisis that would prove whether their bond was strong enough to survive when the very foundations of their world were threatened. 2 years after the rescue that brought them together, Atlas, Scout, and Denali faced the ultimate test of their unprecedented bond. Forest fires, driven by record drought and unprecedented winds, were racing toward their territory with unstoppable force. For the first time since Scout's rescue, their survival would depend not on cooperation, but on the agonizing decision of whether to flee together or separately. The smoke had been visible for 3 days, a growing wall of orange and black that consumed everything in its path. Wildlife evacuation protocols were clear. Bears and eagles had vastly different strategies for surviving massive fires. Bears sought water and underground shelter. Eagles rode thermal currents to altitudes where they could outfly the flames and find safe territory hundreds of miles away. Atlas understood the mathematics of their situation with the grim intelligence that had kept him alive for 12 years in Alaska's wilderness. If they stayed together, following bear survival protocols, Denali would likely perish in the smoke and flames that eagles couldn't escape at ground level. If they separated, following each species' optimal survival strategy, their family would be destroyed even if they all lived. Scout, now 2.5 years old and weighing 300 pounds, had grown into a magnificent young bear who still looked to both his fathers for guidance. The young grizzly had never known a world where Atlas and Denali weren't partners, where his family didn't include wings as well as claws. The concept of separation was as foreign to him as the concept of fire itself. Dr. Chen's research team had been forced to evacuate 2 days earlier, but not before documenting what would become the most heart-wrenching wildlife footage ever captured. The cameras showed Atlas sitting at the edge of their territory, staring at the approaching wall of flame, while Denali perched nearby in obvious distress. Both animals understood what the fire meant, and both were paralyzed by a choice that nature had never intended them to face. The decision came at dawn on what would be their last day in the territory that had become their home. Atlas made his choice with the same decisive courage that had driven him to ask an eagle for help 2 years earlier. He was not going to let fire destroy what love had created. Using the complex communication system they had developed, Atlas conveyed his plan to Denali and Scout. They would travel together, but not according to bear protocols or eagle protocols. They would create their own survival strategy, one that incorporated the strengths of both species while protecting the vulnerability of their unprecedented family unit. Atlas would lead them toward the river system that formed the natural fire break 20 miles north of their current position. But instead of the direct route that bear logic would dictate, they would follow a path that included thermal updrafts and wind patterns that would allow Denali to fly at low altitude, staying close enough to guide them around dangerous areas while conserving energy for the long journey ahead. Scout would travel between them, close enough to Atlas for protection, but positioned where Denali could maintain visual contact and provide aerial intelligence. The young bear had learned to interpret eagle calls so precisely that he could follow Denali's guidance even when his father couldn't see the bird above the smoke. Their journey through the burning wilderness became a masterpiece of interspecies cooperation under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Denali scouted safe passages through the flames, calling down route information that Atlas interpreted and followed with Scout close beside him. When smoke became too thick for the eagle to fly safely, Atlas used his superior ground-level navigation to guide them through terrain that Denali's aerial perspective couldn't assess. The most critical moment came when they reached a river crossing where the bridge had already been consumed by flames. The water was deep and fast-moving, passable for strong swimmers like bears, but potentially fatal for an eagle if he became waterlogged. Atlas could have swum across easily with Scout, but that would mean abandoning Denali to face the approaching fire alone. Instead, Atlas made a decision that redefined the very concept of family loyalty. He and Scout entered the water together, but slowly, creating a stable platform of bear bodies that Denali could use as a resting point during his crossing. The eagle, trusting his life to the family that had accepted him, landed on Atlas's broad back and allowed the massive grizzly to ferry him safely across the dangerous water. When they finally reached the safety of the natural fire break, all 3 animals collapsed in exhaustion. They had traveled 20 miles through a burning wilderness, navigated obstacles that would have challenged any single species, and arrived together, intact, unbroken. Dr. Chen's team found them 3 days later, resting in a meadow beside the river that had saved their lives. The footage of their reunion became the most watched wildlife video in Internet history, not because of its action or drama, but because of the pure joy visible in three animals who had chosen to face death together rather than live apart. Atlas, Scout, and Denali had proven something that science was still struggling to understand. They had demonstrated that love transcends every boundary that evolution had ever created, that family is not determined by genetics or species, but by the simple decision to care for each other more than you care for yourself. Their story became a symbol of hope in a world increasingly divided by artificial boundaries. It showed that cooperation was possible between the most unlikely partners, that families could be created through choice rather than birth, and that the greatest strength in nature wasn't the ability to survive alone. It was the courage to refuse to let go of those you love. As Dr. Chen wrote in her final research paper, Atlas asked an eagle to save his cub, and in doing so, created a family that redefined what family means. Their story reminds us that love is not a human invention. It is the force that connects all living things when we have the courage to reach across the distances that separate us. Today, 5 years after the rescue that started it all, Atlas, Scout, and Denali still patrol their territory together. Scout has grown into a magnificent adult bear who has never known a day without his eagle brother watching over him from the sky. Atlas has become a grandfather figure to eaglets that Denali has raised, teaching them that not all ground-dwelling creatures are threats. And Denali, the golden eagle who answered a father's desperate plea, continues to prove every day that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones that nature never planned, but love made inevitable. This incredible true story shows us that love knows no boundaries, not species, not instinct, not even the laws of nature itself. Atlas didn't just save his Cub Scout. He created a family that redefined what family means. Their bond reminds us that the greatest courage isn't facing danger alone. It's refusing to abandon those we love, no matter how impossible the odds. Denali's answer to a father's plea became proof that compassion exists everywhere in nature, waiting for the brave enough to ask for help. If this remarkable story moved your heart, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and share this video with someone who believes that families come in all forms and love conquers all barriers. Because sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't survival of the fittest. It's the decision to lift each other up when we fall.